brace yourself. This is going to be a little bit of a rant because on the show tonight, I want to talk about the protest group Community Action for Rainbow Rights. This is the group of activists here in Sydney who protested George Pell's funeral today. I want to talk about what a low act I think that is and how that's going to do damage to the greater LGBTIQ plus community here in Australia, and how these people do not represent the community that they say they represent, and that all people, media included, should not align the two together whatsoever. But first, a little bit of background on this group. The group are currently known as Community Action for Rainbow Rights. They were formerly known as Community Action Against Homophobia. And they're also loosely tied with another group called Pride in Protest. They seem to be all the same members, but they just wear different hats and rebrand when it suits. I do know why. Well, I know of reasons why I think they've had name changes and rebranding. I don't know for sure. I don't have the actual facts on that, but it is my belief that the rebranding of this group from Community Action Against Homophobia to Community Action for Rainbow Rights is because the previous names were tainted by bad behaviour from its members. And this group have been a bane in the side of the LGBTI community for years, going back to the same-sex marriage debate. In fact, I remember I was working in the media at the time, and this group were, well, they were included as part of the movement for change, for the yes vote. But after going to a few of the rallies, the more sensible activists going for change kind of put them at arm's length because of their horrible language and behaviour that they were taking to their protests that they were setting up. It was terrible. But they, like I said, they've been a bane in the side of the LGBTI community for years. And in fact, they've been trying, here's some news that's not being reported by the media, they've been trying to hijack the Sydney Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras for years, to turn it into an extension of their activist group and move it away from the globally recognised institution that it is today. The group Community Action for Rainbow Rights, aka Pride in Protest, aka Community Action Against Homophobia, as a group, well, they've been plagued in the past with allegations of racism from within its own ranks, with accusations of bullying from its group leaders by former members who have come out and publicly addressed this, but the group have not addressed this publicly in return. Like I said, they rebrand. And I believe they rebrand to bury past discrepancies, to hide their true skeletons in their closet. A closet they hope not to come out of. But for some of us, we will always remember. And when they do ratbag things like they did today, protesting a funeral, we'll speak about it. This progressive group, in my mind, are not very progressive at all. They're an angry bunch of people with accusations of being racist and bullies. But this self-elect group, this self-elect activist group, Community Action for Rainbow Rights, who claim, without being appointed, to be the group who speaks out for the LGBTI community and the community rights here in Australia, do so without consulting the community first. This ratbag group are the ones who protested today at the funeral of the Australian Cardinal of the Catholic Church, George Pell. Now, let me get this out at the beginning. I am no fan of George Pell. He has actively campaigned against LGBTI rights for years. For years. The LGBTI community, which I am a member of, and he was also accused of historical child sexual abuses that all happened in 2019, where he spent more than a year in jail before the High Court overturned the decision in 2020. I am not a fan of the man, not whatsoever. But I don't want to get into the historical allegations in this rant, because that's a whole different can of worms that I'm not prepared to open today. It's in my belief that you'd find it hard to find a member of the LGBTI community who supports George Pell. He's not liked. But it'd also be hard to find a majority of the LGBTI community who think that protesting at his funeral is a good idea. Or at least members of the community who have lived experience and can think things through, think of the consequence of actions. You see, Community Action for Rainbow Rights are made up of a group of young activists, and I'm sure they have the best intentions at heart, but what they don't have is lived experience. You know, lived experience, so you make sound and better judgment ahead of doing something like protesting a funeral. That will set precedent and will have backlash on the community that they say they represent. Let's deep dive into this, but to do so, we need to take a trip back in history. The time when mistakes were made and we learned from them so we did better in the future. Back in the early 2000s, we saw the rise of the religious group or family cult that was built around its patriarch, Fred Phelps. It was called the Westboro Baptist Church. I'm sure when I say that, you get visual images of signs that they used to make and protest. Signs like God hates fags and death penalty for fags. They'd go and picket funerals. And they were relentless. And they did this daily. And they would travel all over the United States to picket the funerals of gay victims of murder or gay bashings, as well as those of people who had died from complications related to AIDS. It also picketed other events related to homosexuality. They also picketed things like the funerals of the victims of the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting, as well as military funerals. They were a radical group of obnoxious zealots. And I'm drawing a comparison to the Community Action for Rainbow Rights group. Once the leader died in 2014, the Westboro Baptist Church, well, they fizzled away. But after that, there was a collective mindset globally that determined that it was not okay to protest funerals. In fact, here in Australia, it is against the law to disrupt a funeral, whether it's a secular funeral or a religious funeral. You run the risk of a $10,000 fine. Now, we all know why Community Action for Rainbow Rights is protesting the funeral today. But what I want to ask is, have they thought this through? Have Community Action for Rainbow Rights thought of the precedent that their actions set today and the consequence, the future consequence that this brings on the LGBTI community as a whole in Australia that they say they represent? To that question, I say no. Here are my thoughts on this. Firstly, it's never okay to protest a funeral. The person is dead. You have no effect on their life by protesting. You just annoy and aggravate those who are there to grieve the loss of a family member or friend. By protesting, you make enemies of those people they're grieving. And that is not what the LGBTI community is about. Year on year, we've had Mardi Gras festivals where the themes were focused around love. Showing love, spreading love, sharing love, inviting love. That's how we won same-sex marriage. We brought people on the journey with us. We didn't make enemies of those who thought differently. We educated them. That's how a civilized society works. And speaking of this, and back to this protest, just on a side note, I don't get it. What's the purpose? A protest is to protest change. How is protesting a dead man and his actions going to make change? It's not. When you protest a funeral, you set a precedent that says, and this is where it's dangerous, if we don't like you, we will protest your funeral in the name of the LGBTI community in Australia, even though the LGBTI community of Australia have not collectively or in a majority said that it's okay to do so in our name, which is something I want to look at further in a second. But before I do, once you set a precedent of protesting a funeral, you invite others to do the same. There will be retaliation by opposing activist groups. Did they not think this through? Where is their common sense? As for the LGBTI community in Australia, let's take a look at the figures and then marry that up with the figures of support that this activist group have. As for the LGBTI community in Australia, let's look at the figures. On average in Australia, and I'm using outdated numbers here, so I'm certainly underrepresenting the statistics here because there was no question in the most recent census about the LGBTI community, so we don't know how many of us there are of 2022 was it 2022 when this last census was done? Anyway, what we do know is that there are 26,260,198 people who live in the country of Australia as of Sunday, January 29 in 2023, based on the Worldometer elaboration of the latest United Nations data. Now, the last time the stats were done on the LGBTI community was in 2016, where it was believed that there was 3% of the Australian population were gay, lesbian, bisexual, and other sexual minority identities. Some researchers at the time believed it to be higher at 5.4%. So let's go with the lower number, 3.4% of the Australian population. And if my maths is correct, and maths is not a strong point of mine, then 3.4% of the population of Australia is something like 787,000 people, possibly. That's people who identify as gay, lesbian, bisexual, and any other sexual minority identity. So you'd think, with that number of Australians who identify under the rainbow umbrella, you'd think that, to go and protest in the name of the Australian LGBTI community, you'd have to have a fair amount of support for your activist group to do so. Makes sense, right? You're going to protest in the name of a group, a large group, you'd have their support. That's common sense, isn't it? Well, on the Community Action for Rainbow Rights Facebook page, when I checked it last night, there were 314 people interested in going to their protest and only 146 people saying that they were going to protest, going to go to the protest of George Pell's funeral. And if you've ever worked with social media and Facebook events, you'd know that if 146 people say they're going, less than half turn up. Now, as for the page itself, they have 9,600 followers. I will confess, I do follow them, but I hate follow them, much like I am sure a number of people who follow the page. In fact, I know that's a fact. I know there are many people who follow their page because, they just want to see what crazy antics they're doing because we don't agree with it. But for me, even if all 9,000 Facebook followers on their page were all active, supporting members, that number is nowhere near the numbers reflective of the total LGBT community in Australia. Not enough to say that you speak and protest on the behalf of a community's rights. Community Action for Rainbow Rights, you do not speak for the LGBTI community. Your extreme protest radical beliefs have been voted down time and time and time again by the community you pretend to represent. I've been there at the meetings. It's time to pack up because you do not speak for the community. You are only hurting our community, and you are about to do damage to our community with what you've done today. We have World Pride starting here in Sydney in less than a month. Did you at any stage stop to consider the backlash World Pride is going to get because of your decision to protest a dead man's funeral. Use your brains. People in the wider community who are not part of the LGBTI community will connect the two. Your protest at a funeral and World Pride here in Sydney, even though the two are not linked, because both are said for the LGBTI community. One is agreed that it's for the community, your one isn't. Shame on you for the precedent you have set with this. Shame on you for the public damage you will cause. And shame on you for reversing years and years of hard work of people in our community who have successfully achieved change and equality. Something your ratbag group will never do. Now, like I said before, this is in no way a rant about protest. Protest can be effective. Why I support the thousands of colourful ribbons that were attached to the cathedral's gates, I think last night in Sydney. Sadly, I think they were taken down, and also the gates at the church in Albury. Those were put up in memory of those who suffered sexual abuse by clerics. This is a protest done right. But physically protesting a funeral with a rally with signs set up to disrupt the event is one of the lowest acts of disrespect. Well done, Community Action for Rainbow Rights, for stooping to the low depths of scum that is and was the Westboro Baptist Church. You're no better than them, and you never will be. What a shameful act. I hope you get banned from being involved in the World Pride, because there is no pride in what you do, only shame. You do not speak on behalf of the community you pretend to represent. What you do represent is a series of dangerous ideals, and what you do is tack on your sexuality onto the back of that to try and boost it, with no care in the world for those in the community you hurt and damage along the way. Grow up, do better. Rant over.
The Troy Murphy Show.